Hello and welcome back to the Tiberium Theory Crafting series. Today we will be examining the Sins of GDI. As we looked at in the last episode, USA had an incredible lasting effect on the global defense initiative, from sourcing the original concept, to its implementation, to its leadership. But beyond even that, the GDI seemed to be influenced in its failures. From failing to capitalize on Nod's first and second defeats, to its treatment of the border regions and yellow zones, and finally to its allowing a decade of peace to change its ruling council until a bunch of corporate heads and local despots. All these things and more might be recognizable to those who spent time in political circles, especially outside of America, as aspects of American political culture and history that might not be the most positive. Let me give a quick warning before delving further. I am an American, and I love my country. I'm not a socialist. I'm not on the right either. I'm a centrist. I'm merely following a through line suggested to me by my Discord that I feel is valuable enough to warrant this discussion, and besides maybe one more topic that I can think of, politics won't really play a part in these videos. At the end of the third year of the First Tiberian War, when everything was all but over, much of the world had been ravaged, stained by the feud between the two power bases in the world's political spheres. Nod lay defeated, Cain presumably dead, and the command structure of the Brotherhood was in complete chaos. Little remained of the Nod military. Part of what was left was under control of an agent by GDI. Let's talk about GDI backing Hassan for a moment. While the control over a part of Nod that having an agent in their organization brought, in combating Cainite factions, made the world somewhat more peaceful in the interim period between the wars, it came with deadly consequences. While Anton Slavik was an incredibly influential leader that was hand-picked by Cain to be his successor, and it was important to hinder his projects, siding with Hassan was pretty close to the situation caused by the USA backing Osama bin Laden in order to combat the Soviets. It was a Realpolitik move that perpetuated the rule of dictators in a region that supported and carried out not just war crimes, but also extreme crimes against humanity, including the mass murder of non-Muslims, homosexuals, and anyone who spoke out against the regime, even in the most superficial ways. Hassan did this and more in his part of the Brotherhood, and to a degree, everything that Hassan did is blood on the hands of the GDI Council. Not only that, but Hassan's tenure at the top of Nod witnessed a great period of rearmament, reindustrialization, and technological advancement, which allowed them to keep pace with GDI, which at the time had been spending decades at the top of a pecking order with the best scientists on the planet. This rebuilding was allowed in an attempt to destabilize Nod, but worked just about as well as arming the Taliban did for the United States, if not far worse. While Cain's rise to power had been a complete paradigm shift, it had not been complete. Some peoples in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and Africa still called out for the salvation of a GDI army to liberate them, to restore order in the wake of the war, restore their nations to their former glory, not unlike the peaceful people of Eastern Europe called out to the West for the intervention when the Soviets held dominion over their states. But in World War II and their First Tiberian War, GDI stopped short of the finish line. Likely, this was because of the political interference of the member states, as well as the other UN states, likely between a state of thankfulness and outrage at the scale of the destruction, each looking for a piece of the power within the newly formed world-conquering army. Just as in World War II, politics and disunited polities squabbling over territorial and resources concessions got in the way of finishing the final war. The one that, had it been won early enough, could have led the world down a path of liberty and avoided the terror that reigned in the decades of Cold War. GDI left the remnants of Nod to live in the rapidly developing yellow and red zones, to fend for themselves and go into hiding. They left them to consolidate into cells that fermented more and more, until the people that once called out for aid now called out for the blood of their would-be saviors. As GDI member countries strive to rebuild their parts of the world, their first period between wars happened. and the Tiberium really began to ravage the globe. More and more the economy of the world began to change, more and more drastically in each passing year as crop fields turned barren crystal fields, and ion storms covered once verdant landscapes. Rapid development of technology was underway, but without the complete effort, not enough ground was covered, and not still spreading the crystal, it was impossible to meet the demands of the growing crisis. The Second War came and went. For the second time, the subjugation of Nod came and went, and once again, the even more mighty GDI, this time absorbing the entire nations into its fold, once again failed to take complete measures against Nod, and Cain was given a third chance to rise. Yes, there were mitigating factors, such as the growth of Tiberium, but the combined might of all the world's remaining manufacturing centers should have been able to handle this. Instead, GDI left new yellow zones to Nod and focused on the remaining blue zones, granting Cain a welcome bed to use to fuel his next bid for hegemony. We can take a look at this from another perspective too, by examining the USA Western-centric policies that GDI took in these periods. As I mentioned before, any organization is loyal to those paying the bills, and GDI is no exception. As the zones were established, GDI centers of administration grew up in around them to help organize the response to Tiberium. But oddly, the largest blue zones exist only in Western Europe and USA, as well as the first major area to feel complete restoration was in Germany, a member state in the G8 countries. This is partially because Tiberium grows far slower in cold climates for whatever reason, but undoubtedly, GDI was evacuating much more of the Western population to the Northern Hemisphere at a faster rate than any of the other places, such as Rio. Places in South and Central America, Africa, and Asia did not enjoy the resources and attention lavished on the blue zones by GDI. Millions, if not billions, of people suffered as a result of the decision to prioritize those areas, which was most certainly, at least partially, decided out of a sense of tribalism based in the West. Another look at this can be found in how absent GDI was in conflicts like the Civil War in China after and during the Second Tiberium War, and other conflicts that existed in war zones mostly untouched by either faction, like India, Africa, or South America, where untold violence and conflict damaging already damaged infrastructure impacted the people there in horrible ways, driving masses of them over time to Nod by simple necessity. Yes, GDI sent aid to these places, but given it is in the war that yellow zones were mostly administered by Nod and were relatively loyal to them, it is unlikely that the abatement efforts in these areas were as fully funded as those in the fringes of the blue zones. Another vector with honest criticism is how they handled the after effects of the Firestorm conflict. In those days, in the aftermath of the war, they declared the world that the crisis was over, the Cabal was dead, and Nod was finally defeated. But under the tundra in rural Russia, there were tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of biomechanical soldiers, the marked of Cain, and Cain himself regenerating in a Cabal chamber. The extent to which GDI knew about this and what was down there is unknown, although we can determine some of it by observing the fact that they did not level the entire site from orbit, but did guard it heavily. And when Cain breached the area, they did send heavy reinforcements, suggesting that they knew something was down there that they desperately did not want to wake up. It's like building a house over a sleeping nest of army ants and telling the new owners that there really are no worries. Not to mention the fact that GDI themselves created a red zone in Australia by secretly developing liquid Tiberium and experimenting on it. Sure, it was not C4 that caused the detonation, but without GDI creating it and only lightly guarding the facility, the entire situation could have been avoided. The relatively untouched stretches of Australia would have been an area that could potentially have been used to house many displaced peoples. In addition, one can contemplate the relationship between GDI and the yellow zones, where there is almost certainly a sort of colonial, semi-feudal relationship, as blue zones lacked Tiberium and the yellow zones were full of toxic chemicals. making them the main industrial resource zones for the new supranational GDI entity. GDI used weapons that were banned by the Geneva Conventions, such as napalm, and developed a new WMD that, while not nuclear and long-term toxic, was perfectly capable of making a large area completely unlivable in a blink of an eye. It is said that most of the yellow zones were governed by NOD, but enough of them were governed by GDI that enclaves under GDI administration appeared after the Second War. And these places, as we can see from the Rio insurrection, were run like private fiefdoms by corrupt GDI officials leading small private armies, with either too little funding to abate Tiberium seriously, or too little humanity left to care about making sure that the credits got back into the hands of the dispossessed. This behavior might not seem familiar to those with knowledge of the 19th or 20th century USA, as although America, through its doctrines, was opposed to colonialism, still pursued the Monroe Doctrine, taking Central and Southern America under its wing then, and destabilizing them for the purpose of thwarting the interests of the European powers. Not only that, but as Video Crow's Nest, the epic human, who helped to brainstorm and edit this, mentioned, quote, GDI consumed nations, and wasn't very keen on keeping the local ways, quote, as GDI expanded, they weren't really very keen on keeping the local ways of governing and of culture, and nearly all places that they came to were ruled just like the US. Destructions of a people's culture, heritage, customs, language, and any number of other signs is a form of genocide. Now, of course, GDI's way of doing it is just a smooth, let it erode away as all things fall apart by proxy of apathy. A global defense initiative that expands its rulership would need to account for preservation of things as part of its mandate. Instead, everyone spoke English, was Americanized, and was being ruled from another continent. A lot of these points about GDI having its main core from the US might not seem as big as they are if one was from the US and still living in the US. But looking at it from the point of view of living somewhere else, in countries not in the West, and you can start to see where the sympathies of the people in these areas might actually lie. To be so negligent and arrogant as to let different national identities, cultures, entire histories of people just be consumed by Tiberium, not to be so fussed about it, while focusing power in the US and Europe, it's a sin. Unquote. Finally, GDI allowed, in the years before the beginning of the Third Tiberium War, for much of its top brass, who could have been composed of the best and brightest of their constituents, to be formed instead out of corporate executives, bankers, and leaders of special interest groups. This ineffective and lame leadership led the institutions to near ruins just before the war started, and certainly didn't help any of the rest of the world cope with the crisis any better. And allowing the situation where there were no adequate replacements able to step in the event that we're all killed shows a lack of forethought that is difficult to comprehend. Ultimately, this video is a look at the Realpolitik decisions that GDI made in the fight against NOD and the destruction of the world to a rotting, crystallizing death to Tiberium. If you take a look at them one at a time, or even as a whole picture, it is startling to see just how much bad the good guy faction participated in just a few decades up until the end of the Third War. There's even something to be said, if only slightly true, for the claim that NOD makes of GDI being a colonial third position power. While this is true, we must take into deep consideration what governing people looks like in times of unprecedented violence and conflict, of rampant disease, infrastructure decay, and martial law. The term Realpolitik is something that everyone needs to take in mind whenever someone is judging the actions of a leader thrust into an impossible situation. Remember that the GDI High Council were making decisions every day to save some from dying to Tiberium poisoning that could lead to tens of thousands more to suffer from constant cancers gained from drinking infected water or mining tib without an environment suit. Every decision involves death, and each second that is wasted is another death to indecision. When one says that they wish to finish the war with Nod totally and completely, are you saying that you are capable of making a decision that would lead to millions of more people dying for a belief that they have, however misguided? Are you willing to do what it takes to eradicate the enemy, down to the last man, erasing their culture, even entire ethnic groups off the face of the world? When the deed is done, how will you pick up the pieces of the men that you sent to do the deed, to make them stop hearing the screaming in the night? And how will you absorb the criticisms of your people when the war is over and the next generation comes to ask you why you ordered the killing of millions? And there's a finite, never-dwindling number of people and resources, and access to those resources is continually restricted, and it's your job to ensure the life and safety of everybody. Some of the people you love and other people that you hate, what decisions will you make? GDI is an organization that is deeply human and flawed, and over the decades it has continued to make mistakes, leading to the deaths of countless people. But unlike Nod, who has done these things and much more, the express purpose of everything that GDI does is to return the world to the place it was before 1995. The road to hell might be paved with good intentions, but the Earth and the Tiberium universe is, in my humble opinion, deeply, deeply lucky to have the stewards that it does, because with everything we know about the depths humanity can plummet to, it could be far, far worse. Eventually, humanity will defeat the menace and reach victory, and everyone left will have to take stock and count the cost. Hopefully, at that end, our children don't condemn us for what it took to secure their future. Thank you for listening, and I know this was a bit of a heavy topic here, but the Soviet animation is just about finished, and I want to start getting onto some of those topics because those are more fun. We can start doing some individual unit videos again, and I just can't wait to get into it. But if you found this video interesting, please consider liking and subscribing or leaving a comment. That would be really helpful. I also have a Patreon, but only do that if you think that you want to. I am extremely grateful to anyone, no matter what they do. Just by watching, you make my day better. Anyway, thank you, and have a nice day. This is the Game Master Karakin signing off.